We'll just give it a minute or two here to wait for folks to jump on the GoToWebinar. Sometimes there's some difficulty switching between the invite and the actual webinar, so hopefully folks are not blocked. I think we can probably get started. Folks will probably trickle in as we keep moving here. So this is the PCI DSS version 4.0.1 vulnerability management, the easy button, kind of tailored to fuel and convenience retail, but retail in general. The Omega ATC team, we've been getting a ton of questions around vulnerability scanning and management. Some of the folks of you on this call may know that the evolving requirements under PCI 4.0.1 went into effect last April. And what we've largely observed is that many merchants who went through their first PCI audit under those requirements held off on full implementation of authenticated scanning as well. And so now auditors are coming back after the first season of QSA audits, and they're asking and saying, hey, authenticated scanning needs to happen. And a lot of retailers waited on implementing it, and candidly, with good reason. There are real implementation challenges in the fuel and retail industry. There's confusion about the general requirements and what they're asking for, where the allowances are. And then layered on top of that, we're seeing obviously a lot of conversation around AI and AI-driven attacks. And so this topic of vulnerabilities is becoming a lot more relevant. So we wanted to do this webinar and get clear on the PCI requirements, understand the impact of AI on the vulnerability landscape, and then think through the nitty-gritty of implementing authenticated scanning in the fuel retail environment, and really just retail environments more broadly. For those of you on this call who are not in convenience retail, this discussion will still apply for sure. And another thing we'll do is we'll provide some recommendations on the difference between what PCI is actually asking for in this standard, which is vulnerability management, versus just running vulnerability scans. So on this call, I'm Ash Swami, CEO of Omega ATC. We manage security and PCI compliance for retailers nationwide. And then joining me is Matthew Koenig from Nodeware. Can you hear us okay, Matt?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Nodeware is a vulnerability management platform built to be lightweight and efficient, and it's especially effective for scanning sensitive devices. Staying ahead of remediation and the reporting is amazing. And so Omega ATC and Nodeware have been working closely together to address this for retailers. So I'm glad to have Matthew on with us. But before we get started, I believe, Nor, that we have a poll. So if you had to show proof of authenticated scanning for your retail environment, and don't be bashful about responding here, how likely is it, if you're a retailer, that you would pass? And we may reveal the poll results at the end of this call, but select one if you don't think it's likely. This is confidential, that you don't think you would pass an audit if it took place today, versus 5 extremely likely. And we'll give it one more minute. Now, between us, if we get a high percentage that it's extremely likely, I might question that, but.
Looks like 3 is the big one right now.
Okay. Why don't we give it just 10 more seconds and we'll keep moving here. So Nora, I think we can probably close the poll for now. So just kind of continuing on here, let's just get into the AI of it all. People are seeing different headlines. OpenAI, they recently released what they called an agentic security researcher, so that it's primarily designed to analyze codes for developers, right? Identify flaws, help developers patch vulnerabilities before software is deployed. And then similarly, in a different way, Anthropic deployed their latest model. It found 500 previously unknown high severity flaws in open source libraries with almost no prompting. So what we're generally seeing, and I think there's a lot of questions as to how exactly AI is impacting the landscape. These tools are being used to research attack paths, automate exploitation steps, and it is lowering the barrier of entry for attackers. And so there's this dual use reality of developers and security teams using these tools to make code and software and systems more secure, but in some way, shape, or form, this is also open to the attackers as well. And I think we have some stats here. Well, let me just hit this. So the time between discovery and exploitation is shrinking. And we're going to talk about that a few different times as we discuss here. Some stats, right now, there's about a 34% year-over-year increase of exploitation of vulnerabilities as the initial access vector. About a third are exploited within a day of disclosure, and there's a 38% year-over-year increase in number of CVEs reported. So just a couple points to make, and we'll kick it to Matthew here in a moment. Let's talk about what a vulnerability is. It may seem basic to everyone, but I think it's worth mentioning. Vulnerability is a defect in software or hardware or configuration that can be exploited to gain unauthorized access or cause unintended behavior. But we want to make sure we make this differentiation between vulnerability and risk. And what PCI 4.0.1 is really asking for is to manage risks. And so there are many more vulnerabilities being reported, but the question is, how do we manage risk in this environment where vulnerabilities are being reported at a greater and greater rate, and that gap in time between reporting and exploitation is shrinking? And I think, Matthew, is this one of your GPT prompts here before we launch our next poll?
Yeah, it's mine. You know, the idea of this was to show, I don't care who you are, if you can type, I can find out not only how to get to the dark web, I can find the tool to get to the dark web, and I can get guidance on how to get to where I want to go. I mean, it says, you know, forums and communities. Well, everybody knows that's Discord, Reddit. There are a few out there that I won't name because I'm not going to help people do that. But I mean, the reality is it is so easy to get to the dark web. And on the dark web right now, I can say I'm looking for ransomware as a service. Okay, $100, where are you headed? Or, hey, I need help doing this. And for $25, they'll write the code for you. It's just ridiculous. If a 15-year-old understands what's going on in the world, a 15-year-old could be holding you for ransom.
Absolutely. So I think that kind of tees up our next question, or if we can launch the next poll. On a scale of 1 to 5, how concerned are you about AI-driven cyber attacks impacting retail environments? So 1 is not concerned, 5 is extremely concerned, and we'll give it just a minute here to get some responses.
So far, it looks like 3s and 4s.
You know, while we wait here, I did talk to a team member who's in the privacy team of OpenAI, and just to be upfront, even though these guys put guardrails, these platforms around their tools and around their prompts, they are also extremely concerned. Not to bias the audience here, but you know, the question for us in this webinar is, to what degree can defense be upgraded faster than offense, right?
Well, what about the guy recently? It was in the news. It took, what was it, 19,000 words in 8 hours, but he talked Claude into overriding the security protocols that are in. By just having a conversation. I mean, literally, the conversation, they didn't print it all, but they said it was like talking to a friend and being empathetic and explaining why they needed to. 19,000 words in 8 hours. Now, everybody's going to go, well, that's a lot. Not if you're motivated.
Yep.
That's a work day. That's it. And I got them to override their security protocols, so they helped me do whatever I wanted to do. I don't know about you, but that scares the heck out of me.
I mean, these releases are coming extremely quickly, and one wonders how much they're testing it in the wild. Even though they're obviously having these releases a few years out, you don't really know how they're going to work until it's in the wild, right? You know, we got to touch on the PCI of it all, especially now that we have this context around the vulnerability landscape. So what is PCI asking in version 4.0.1 here? Number 1, perform authenticated internal vulnerability scanning. We're not just looking at network and kind of external system vulnerabilities, but application level vulnerabilities. The second is define remediation timelines using that PCI targeted risk analysis. So they want you to assess the risks in your card data environment and then define timelines based on the critical, the highs, the mediums, the lows as it pertains to the merchant's specific environment. The third here is address all vulnerabilities, not just critical or high, in alignment with internal risk rankings. And the point to be made there is, once again, a vulnerability is different from an exploit. A lot of these vulnerability ratings are actually just based on how difficult they rate the vulnerability in order to be able to exploit. But the risk pertains to the specific environment and whether there's an active exploit out in the wild that a hacker has used and leveraged this vulnerability as part of a larger attack chain. And so because of that, they want all vulnerabilities to be addressed and managed. And then the last is requirement 6.3.1. Every vulnerability, including open source software and proprietary software and so on, has to have and be assigned a risk ranking. So I think if you look at these requirements in the greater context of more vulnerabilities, more reporting, shorter time frame between the vulnerability disclosure and the exploit, this should make some sense. And I guess my question to Matthew is, given the context we have here about the threat landscape, how are hackers thinking about the retail segment today?
Oh, they love the retail segment. Love it. Here's why. Few reasons. One, a lot of them aren't protected real well. They have a single firewall and they think that's protecting them. Not protecting them at all. Why? Because they have thousands of employees, okay? Hundreds of employees. If you can give me an employee, I can get around your firewall. And I'm not even a hacker, okay? Second thing, it's not about size, it's about transactions.
Mm-hmm.
If I was running a business out of my home, just myself, let's say an Etsy thing, but I had a ridiculously popular product. So I had 5,000 sales a month with 5,000 different credit cards. My credit cards spend the same way as anybody else's. So most retail places have high transactions, high amount of information, and therefore it is a gold mine. The final thing is it's a spider web. Almost every retail corporation is a spider web, which means if I can get into corporate, I can get into every location. If I can get into a location, I can get back into corporate. For those of you that are aware, the Kaseya hack a while ago, they're an RMM tool. And what happened was a hacker was able to go through their back door, get through their next-gen firewall. But in doing so, now they got to every single MSP that was attached to them using that software. Once they got to the MSPs, they got to every single customer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was brilliant. One hack, and they got to thousands and thousands of customers.
And that breach, by the way, did impact convenience retail. I know 3 cases.
Yeah, so I mean, the reality is, and you thinking that your data is not valuable, your data is as valuable as somebody else's. And here's the cool part. What's the reason I want your data? Well, 1, I can hold you for ransom. That's the big payday. 2, stolen card data sells anywhere from $5 to $20 out there on the web. And if I steal, I don't know, 10,000 cards, which is easy to do, right? Look at the money I made like that.
Mm-hmm.
Login credentials. So when your login credentials get on the dark web, will people go, oh, everybody's on the dark web? Well, guess what? When your work credentials end up out there, it's worth $50 to $200+ to people, depending on the size of the location, depending on the complexity of the location, depending on how many transactions are available.
And I think, we could probably jump around here because I think we have some good, right here, what you're talking about in terms of credentials.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, if someone wants your credentials, they're going to get your credentials. And if you think that they don't care about you, in some cases, you're 100% right. They don't care about you.
Mm-hmm.
But they will use different methodologies to find an open hole.
Right.
But once again, even if you have, I don't know, I'm going to pick a number, 5 retail locations.
Yep.
And you have a corporate office and they're doing decent business, you are an extremely high value target. I will sit outside your gas station. I will use pin pad collectors to collect data. I will try to hack into Wi-Fi if you have it. I will walk in and talk to your person. I will get to you because you're small, meaning in reference to you're not a Target, you're not a Home Depot.
Right.
But your 10,000 transactions a month are fantastic for me. It's amazing.
Well, I think this speaks to your point. You know, when you and I were talking ahead of this, obviously vulnerability management and kind of this vulnerability side of things versus, let's say, what a hacker does, or thinking a bit more from a pen testing perspective, that initial phase is about scalability. I mean, how, you know, kind of as we look at Shodan and things like that, I mean, what's the scalability size of this, and how does that relate to the small operator who thinks, hey, I'm off the radar?
Yeah, what's cool is there are things called spread attacks, okay, for instance. And here's what I want you to think about. You think a next-gen firewall doesn't get breached. Well, guess what? Think of the companies you've heard about getting breached in the last year. Trust me, they had next-gen firewalls, okay?
And not to pick on Cisco, but that is the example we have up on the screen here.
Yeah, I mean, there you go. And there are sites where you can look up, here's a piece of equipment, what are the current known vulnerabilities? And they're up to date within the hour. So I can go, oh, here's this. Let me go after this vulnerability. So think about it this way. You're in a ballroom. It's a 40,000 square foot ballroom. I'm going to take a hole saw and I'm going to drill 4-inch size holes just indiscriminately all over the place. And I'm going to cover half with a cover. Then I'm going to go to the wall. I'm going to make a ramp across the entire backside wall. It's going to be 20 feet high. And I'm going to get a dozen people. And we're all at the same time going to dump 1 million marbles. Are you willing to truly bet your business that a marble isn't going to end up in your hole? Are you? Because I know I'm not.
So then to your point, it's something we talked about is, okay, somebody says, hey, my external firewall is configured properly, everything else, there's no vulnerabilities, but if a marble is able to get in, what is then that role of internal scanning versus being able to scan externally like this screen shows?
Well, if I can get in, I can go sideways, I can go up, I can go round and round. The more things you have locked down by closing down any vulnerabilities you have internally, the more I'm trapped once I get in.
Right.
Think about it this way. I walk into your house, or I walk into a facility, right? My son-in-law works in a nuclear facility. And he's a nuclear scientist. Evidently, my daughter did way better than her father. So when you walk in and out, they trap you in a room to test for radiation every time he walks in and out. Now, if you've closed down all of your vulnerabilities via internal scanning, when I walk in, I'm stuck in a glass box, right? Stuck in that glass box, banging on the walls, trying to figure out, you know, a way out of it. However, if you have a vulnerability and I know I can kick the bottom right of the glass and it's going to shatter, I can go wherever I want. So the reality is, and also we're taking out of the picture, okay, bad actors. Do you really think, okay, that it takes a lot for someone that's internal, if your vulnerabilities aren't shored up internally, to steal data or to get access to things? So many people think you have to be a genius to do that. You don't. You can go to a YouTube video and learn how to do that. So do you trust every single one of your employees enough to leave stuff open and available, holes, for them to get to? I don't know about you, but I've heard hundreds of stories over the years about employees getting mad and taking down companies.
So, I mean, I think what you're pointing to, though, kind of in the bigger picture here, is the external vulnerabilities, these ASV scans that everyone's concerned about. That's addressing kind of the initial phase of attacks where they're looking for scalable approaches to finding some hole, right? Then they find some hole and they get in, and then they're asking that question, like you said, how much damage can I do? And then at that point, that's where internal vulnerabilities matter. And those, those vulnerabilities can be system configurations, things like that, that were previously identified with just network vulnerabilities, but also these application level vulnerabilities that authenticated scans are now able to identify. Is that fair to say?
I mean, also, like, I have a pen tester on staff.
Yep.
And he exploited a vulnerability a couple of weeks ago on a customer. Not only was he able to get in, but people leave all kinds of information that you don't think they leave all over the place internally.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to get to a text file that gave him, what did he call it? God credentials.
Right.
To the entire organization. On a simple little text file, he had the keys to the kingdom to go anywhere and do anything he wanted.
Right.
So again, you trust your people that much that they won't do anything, that if you don't take care of this stuff internally, nothing could possibly happen to your business. It would be absolutely foolish to think that. And one last point, do you know how many times I've walked into a retail store,
Mm-hmm.
I won't name the ones, or even a doctor's office, where I could have taken a picture and gotten the login for the pin pad, the transaction pad for credit cards,
Mm-hmm.
or even the password and everything for the front desk computer? Come on.
So I think with all that being said, like we have in the screen here, the previous standard was these quarterly scans. Even now, the standard is 4 consecutive quarters. You need to show proof of passing scans. You're managing all vulnerabilities. You've implemented the remediation timelines. But with that many vulnerabilities being reported and the speed from reporting to exploit shrinking, how do we think about these different scanning approaches, whether it's this kind of point in time vulnerability scanning, continuous, whatever? I mean, what is kind of your take and how do we think about it?
Here's the reality. Vulnerabilities are growing, like you said, with AI and even with humans, and even mistakes made by the manufacturers. So let's not forget that. They don't even do it on purpose, but they make mistakes also. So the vulnerability landscape is doing nothing but growing substantially.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the second biggest reason officially now that people are able to breach systems.
Yep.
It used to be only phishing and only this. Vulnerabilities are the biggest ones at this point. You know why? Because a lot of these vulnerabilities affect the network, don't require administrative access, don't require user interaction. Like literally you can look up the vulnerability and go, oh, that exists. Blah, 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 blah. What's interesting about it is when you're scanning monthly or quarterly, it's a point in time scan. You're getting the information right then and there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you realize the next day that's completely out of date?
Yep.
And there are different levels of vulnerabilities, right? So the way Nodeware happens to rank them, but a lot of programs out there rank them now, are KEV, known exploited vulnerability.
Yep.
They're being used in ransomware right this second. EPSF gives you the percentage score that this will become a KEV within the next 30 days. And then CBSS, which I know PCI uses a lot of, which is saying this is critical, which means if they do hack this,
yep,
it's critical to your infrastructure as far as the damage they can do.
Yep.
If you scan on a Wednesday, guess what? By Friday, you could have 10 KEVs in your system that you're now giving someone 90 days to play with,
right,
to try to get in.
And so, because I have in the back of my mind sort of a lot of the statements or questions that we get from industry. One of them you just addressed. Bottom line, quarterly scans don't cut it. I think the alternative approach is at the very least monthly, but if you're able to implement it, continuous, right?
I mean, the reality at the end of the day is it hasn't been for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not effective anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's now becoming a secondary standard unless you're looking to check the box.
Right.
And here's what I tell people, because as you know, we're a vulnerability management tool. What I always tell people is, look, if you're looking to check the box, right,
mm-hmm.
you know what you're doing. If you're looking to truly keep yourself secure and safe and remediate, then you need to look to doing it much quicker, much more efficiently, right?
Yep.
Continuous is the best way to go, but weekly or at the very least monthly, because of how quickly the environment is moving. If you stay doing the old things based on past information and not keeping up, you're going to be in trouble.
100%. And I think so, kind of like you just said, there's a difference between checking the box and actually doing what's necessary for security. A big statement we hear over and over again when we talk to different retailers is, my managed network service provider is taking care of it. And obviously, that service provider who's managing the edge firewall, that's critical, that's important. Having the segmentation in place is critical. Making sure your egress rules in place, that's absolutely critical and necessary. But that is, once again, we want to hammer home the point, that's the perimeter, but there are multiple ways to get into the perimeter. And once someone is in, then what happens? And so big point here is perimeter security does not equal breach protection or prevention. And just having an MNSP does not mean that your network is fully secure and PCI compliant.
Nope. And by the way, just for what it's worth, we have people all the time go, well, I don't hear people my size getting breached. Really? Shocker. They don't walk around going, I got breached. Hey, by the way, Bob, we're at a meeting today or a convention. I got breached last week. Really? You think people are walking around excited to tell you they got breached? But here's the problem. About 45 out of 50 states now require you to report if you've ever gotten breached.
Correct. And the reporting requirements vary state by state, and some of them are very stringent.
You have to literally report to every single person that's ever done business with you that you got breached. 99% of the time, it's required that you provide them credit monitoring services for up to 2 years to make sure they can monitor their information. But here's the most interesting thing statistically right now, based on Verizon studies, IBM studies, all kinds of studies of what they consider to be SMB, small, medium-sized businesses. On average, when someone gets breached, they lose approximately 50% of their business for the next 12 months. They also lose customers forever, because why aren't you keeping themselves secure? So what I always like to say is, you've got the cost of fixing the breach, you've got the cost of notification, you've got the cost of the monitoring software, but you also have a cost of reputation and lost customers. And here's the thing, I have friends all over the place based on what I do with a living, and I ask them all the time, if someone you knew got breached, would you do business with them? Overwhelmingly, the answer is, if I knew, no, I'd go down the street. So do you believe whatever you offer is so specialized and so amazing that somebody wouldn't go down the street and just, we were talking about retail gas. There are 14 within a mile of my house. If I know this one got breached, why would I not drive to the next one? I don't know one of them that has a convenience store that provides me with something that is so over the top that I must have it no matter what. I mean, Target lost 50% of their business for a year. That was billions. And Target's Target. What I mean by that is, people are more likely to go to Target than they are to go to, a medium-sized business, just because of who they are. They still lost 50% of their business for a year after their breach.
Well, I think you bring up a good point here around losses, right? So a breach, there can be reputational damage, there can be actual damage and fines based on if, data was stolen and so on. There's the costs of the reporting, the legal, this, that, and the other. But I think it's important, like the slide here that we have here, is to touch on the insurance side of it. At a minimum, especially today, when you have these big cyber insurance premiums, typically there's an intake questionnaire form. Are you doing these certain activities that impacts the premium and coverage? One of them invariably is going to be, are you meeting your industry standards? Sometimes they do call out PCI. And I think what folks have to keep in mind, especially those that are level 1 merchants on this call, when a breach takes place and then there's an incident response, that takes place from there, the insurance company will often mandate that their IR personnel is actually there to perform the forensics. And so to bring this back to scanning, there is that aspect of, at the very least, making sure that you're doing what you said you were doing to mitigate those losses, right?
I mean, do you know how many times I've heard in the last, let's call it 3 years,
Yep.
the company attested to stuff they didn't understand just because they wanted to get the insurance application written out. So they go, yeah. And then it turns around and there's a breach, and guess what? Insurance company goes, oh, you didn't even do half of, it's kind of like life insurance is the way I look at it. A lot of people have life insurance. Well, if you have a large policy, you're actually required to get an exam once a year. And you're required to keep yourself in shape because you got to pass the exam.
Right.
Nah, I ain't worried about that. Or you buy medical insurance, right? Thinking you're never, ever going to get sick. So when someone says, is everything okay? You check off, yeah, everything's great. And then your premium goes up when you have a heart attack the next day.
Right.
I mean, the reality is people are attesting to stuff that don't exist, so they're not getting paid. Furthermore, for what it's worth, I have friends in this business. I mean, I've been doing this 25 years, so I know I keep saying I have friends. Well, I do. I've been doing it a long time that are in this business. Remember, the big boys reinsure the smaller ones. The big boys are now starting to require internal and external vulnerability management as part of their requirements for you to get this.
Yep. And I think to your point, you know, as we get into the implementation side of it, and so folks who are on the call, I think we're going to get into sort of the practical realities of implementing this in the fuel and convenience retail environment. Big takeaway here is the merchant is responsible, full stop. And I would say the elephant in the room sometimes in our industry is people saying, okay, my brand might take care of it, or my brand is not asking me for this, or I don't control the point of sale, or the MNSP handles that. And I think one of the statements you said, Matthew, was something about go ask your vendor, go ask your point of sale provider if they're going to ensure your security, right?
Yep. Tell them what your setup is and ask them if they will guarantee that you will never be breached. Otherwise, they will fix it at no charge.
Yep.
You're not going to find one of them. But let me ask you a question. You have this next-gen firewall in place. You have their systems. Why won't they guarantee your security?
What would be the answer to that question?
Answer to that question is because they can't. There's no possible way they can. If they were to do that and say they pay for it, they would be out millions and millions and millions of dollars. Not because their equipment is subpar in any way, shape, or form. So please, let's go on record as saying, I'm not saying anybody's POS systems and their whatever are not built up to standard and everything, and they're not keeping them up. That's not the message.
Yep.
The message is they have the same ability to possibly be breached as anyone else. And you know what? Here's another great hack. I won't name names, but you know, there's some very large POS systems out there. Well, POS systems are used in retailers, and they're used to collect money, and they're used to store transactions. So if I could find a flaw with, let's say, a particular type of POS system, and in this case, I am targeting, right?
Yep.
Wow, what kind of damage could I do? What could I steal if I could find a flaw in any one of those POS systems and then go after them nationwide?
And that's exactly right. I mean, we'll probably get into this later, but this goes to your point of attacks starting out as scalable.
Yep.
The attack gets executed, but once they find that gap and find some vulnerability, attacks go from being scalable to targeted. And you know, either that same retailer, if they've been breached once, can get hit multiple times, or to your point, because we see this in the threat intelligence, once a specific vendor or tool set has a vulnerability that then has a known exploit, that increases the likelihood it's going to be hit elsewhere, or at least targeted.
Absolutely, because they're going to do it on purpose at that point. And here's what I'll tell you. Let me reiterate again. I am not picking on POS system vendors. They do everything they do. They QA, they look for security flaws, they do whatever. Guess who the company that has the most vulnerabilities in the entire world is?
I don't know, Cisco, Microsoft. Well, fair enough, right?
Okay. So if Microsoft, with all of their stuff, and I'm not talking about the number of people that use it, if Microsoft, with all of their dev, and all of their know-how, and all of their knowledge, can put out software where thousands upon thousands upon thousands of vulnerabilities are found, do you think they do that on purpose? So my point with the POS vendors is there's no such thing as perfection, which is why they're not going to guarantee you that even though you have this next gen firewall and you've done this and this, they're not going to guarantee your safety.
Right. And I think that kind of brings it into, well, first of all, our previous slide, the merchant's responsible. And so just a point for those folks on the call, there have to be clear, defined roles and responsibilities. And we don't see any point of sale vendors that take vulnerability scanning under their requirement 11 responsibilities. That's number one. Merchant's responsible, make sure you have those R&R documents in place, and that's something we can help with. But as we get into implementation, let's start thinking about the environment itself, right? You have legacy point of sale systems in many different areas, and also specialized operating systems, things like that. You have different service provider agreements, some where the retailer is fully responsible for managing and configuring the point of sale, others where it's left to the service contractor, others where the point of sale vendor is doing the majority of the management and the retailer is really just having users and so on. You have restrictive network architectures that once again may be managed by a third party. You have pumps and pinpads and critical devices that can't be disrupted. I mean, one of the reasons we had this call is folks talking about running one of the known scanners out there and knocking off a pinpad, knocking off something at a Verifone site, knocking off something at, in their branded environment. And so obviously we don't want to be thinking about security that ultimately disrupts operations. And then going back to what we discussed earlier, there's limited clear guidance between all these different third parties and documented architecture as to how to implement authenticated scanning, whether it's Verifone, Gilbarco, NCR, GK, Bullock, Toast, we can go on, in those environments. And so I say let's just dive in, Matthew. And feel free to jump in if there's anything I'm forgetting as I walk through this, but I think what we want to show here is just the basic steps and things to be thinking about, if you're a fuel and convenience retailer. First things first, your point of sale architecture, right? If you're Verifone or Gilbarco or NCR, ask yourself, am I allowed to install third-party software? If I am, does that mean I'm going to be doing mainly installing agents for host-based scanning, or does the point of sale environment not allow for third-party installation, and then it has to be more network-based architecture? We speak to retailers out there that have a very mixed environment. So they have different food service, they have different brands, they have different point of sales. Before even diving into all this, take a step back, look at your enterprise, assess the different roles and responsibilities, and assess the different environments, and then get a clear picture of what does that mean you're allowed to do or able to do when it comes to deployment. So first step there. Second step, your MNSP. A lot of these authenticated scanners have very specific egress requirements, whether it's to go out to the scanners if they're cloud-based, or if it's agent-based, they have their specific IP lists and so on, URL-based allowance, what ports need to be open. Is that even viable in your environment? After that, like we just talked about, host-based versus network-based. I can say for those environments that do not allow for third-party software to be installed, it's probably not going to be host-based. And you have to ask yourself, is the scanner going to be deployed to your corporate environment? Is it going to be deployed, through the cloud? Is it going to be deployed on local hardware? Or does your managed network service provider have some sort of VPN or cloud concentrator environment that you can leverage the same support tunnel to your POS? And then once again, kind of roles and responsibilities. So I want to stop there and just kind of make sure that tracks. And Matthew, if I'm forgetting anything, or feel free to jump in.
No, I mean, I don't think you're forgetting anything. The reality is the way you set up your infrastructure is going to have a definitive effect on all kinds of things, right?
Yep.
Can someone get in? If they get in, what can they do?
Yep.
Right. etc. Because here's the thing, again, nowadays, 18-year-olds can figure out a way to get in if they want to, are doing threat attacks, are doing ransomware. I forget who it was a while ago. It was like they found it was an 18-year-old that caused this huge hack somewhere, and they were doing it for fun.
Yep.
Right? So how you set up everything matters. How you protect everything matters. How you take care of everything matters. And what I'll tell you is, it's like a car, right? You're not going to buy a Ferrari if you live on a dirt road with large rocks that you have to go over every day. You have to go up a hill and it snows and ices regularly. You're just not. And if you do, you're going to have problems. You have to buy what's right for the environment. You have to do what's right for your environment.
And so I think to that point, to bring it back to the difference between 4.0.1 and 3.2.1, it's a mouthful, but what they're asking us to focus on and merchants to focus on is risk-based vulnerability management. So what do we mean by scanning versus management? A lot of merchants out there, they have a scanner, set it and forget it, the scanner runs, and that's that. That's vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability management, what's the overall life cycle? 12.3.1, I believe, PCI, you start with your targeted risk analysis, look at your card data environment, and then say, okay, what kind of vulnerabilities and what kind of systems are higher risk versus not? Remediation timeframes. If it's a high risk vulnerability, and we'll get more into what that actually means, if it's a high or critical or high or medium or low, typically criticals will be 30 days, mediums will be 60 days, you know, and so on, right? All the way to typically 120 days, but all of them have to be remediated. And what I'm about to show here is reporting is a little bit different. We're seeing what our QSAs actually asking for. Back in the day, they'd say, okay, here's your 80 sites, give me a quarter of your scan reports for whichever quarter, you know, for 10 of your sites, give me your scan reports for those sites. And you go into your scanner, you do whatever, and you say, okay, site 101, 102, put it in a zip folder and send it. Now they're asking for vulnerability management, which means you are tracking all your vulnerabilities. And what we're seeing more and more as the suggested way of doing this, and I'm going to jump ahead for a second, is a master vulnerability report where you have your CVEs, you have your status, the CVSS scores will give you a sense of the highs, lows, mediums, first detected, last detected, and then how many days. And some simple conditional formatting, you present that and it presents proof that you're managing all the vulnerabilities and all of them ultimately being managed in a given point in time within certain timeframes because it's continuous compliance. Another thing that you and I've been talking about, Matthew, is managing risk. So Matthew mentioned earlier known exploits. If a vulnerability has actually been leveraged and then it's been exploited in the wild, and Matthew mentioned earlier that if a known exploit might be a vendor-specific device, and if we're going from the initial scalable hack, they get on the internal network, all of a sudden they've been able to leverage that vulnerability. Now it's becoming a more targeted attack. And at that point, if there's a known exploit that is industry specific, like Matthew mentioned earlier, that hacker is going to start looking elsewhere, either at other sites of that retailer or beyond. And so, at Omega, what we're looking at is not just, hey, here's a critical CVSS. First thing is we're looking at these known exploited vulnerabilities. What is that exploit? How does that actually pertain to our merchants' environments? And also, there's, I think it's within requirement 6, PCI is asking you to look at threat intel feeds. So for us, it's not only is that a known exploit, is it relevant for our retail or for our environments that we're in, but are we seeing that exploit specifically impacting retail? And the reason this matters is, going back to the challenges of scanning and convenience retail environments, rolling out patches is not always easy. They need to be done in a staged manner, needs to be controlled. So vulnerability management is about always continuously critically thinking what needs to be mitigated first. Well, if you have a giant vulnerability report, what probably needs to be mitigated first is that that has that known exploit that is impacting retail, that's relevant to, our merchant's environment, remediate that first, right? Then go from there. And so it is this constant moving target between seeing these different vulnerabilities release, understanding how it maps to the environment, and then having oversight over the patching schedule. And candidly, it never stops. And PCI is asking merchants to have a dedicated function in place to manage this overall life cycle. I know that's a mouthful there, but Matthew, you and I talked about this a lot, and I don't know kind of how else what other color we might add when we think about managing risk.
Go back to the slide you were just on.
Okay.
Nope, next one.
Next one, the previous one.
And one more off. Nope, one more.
This guy.
There you go.
There we go.
So let me draw everybody's attention to the top there.
Mm-hmm.
This is the high vulnerability, because I hear a lot of times, oh, I only need to deal with criticals. Well, let me explain what that means. The attack vector is they come across the network. So they're not dealing with an individual, okay, specifically. The attack complexity is really low. It's easy to do. They don't need any privileges whatsoever. So they don't need admin credentials or anything like that. There is some kind of user interaction required, but again, we know humans, they're easy to manipulate. Over to the right, what that's saying is there's a high chance if you can do this on this particular device, exploit this vulnerability, there is a high, and that's as far as it goes is high, that they're going to be able to get any confidential data that may exist on that machine.
Mm-hmm.
There's a high probability that they're going to have the ability to change data or change anything on that machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then the availability says they're going to have the ability with this to take down that entire service if they should choose to.
Yep.
That's a problem, right? and that's the stuff we have to look at ongoing.
Yep.
To make sure we're doing what needs to be done based on their environment.
And I think to your point, and I'm really glad you pointed that out, I mean, yes, there are some things that can be automated, but at a certain level, that's why you need human beings to think critically through this before making decisions. And, even, looking at this slide here, you have to do that, but also think about the actual sensitivity of the environment, whether patches can be rolled out, whether other certain compensating controls need to be placed. So this is always a fluid defensive operation when we're thinking about remediation. And then kind of another point I want to add here, even though I don't have it on the slide, one of the challenges in convenience retail is coordinating remediation across the various third parties. Now, something Omega has worked hard on is maintaining those support relationships, because just because a point of sale vendor says, hey, we don't have a patch available, and then the retailer puts in a business justification, that vulnerability is still out there. And so when you start thinking about business justifications and compensating controls, everything that was shown on that previous slide and that Matthew just said comes into play. How critical is that vulnerability? How critical is even how easy is it to exploit it? And then what does that mean for the necessary compensating control, or after which point is a business justification no longer valid and a patch has to be released? And ultimately that takes coordination across many different third parties, and that kind of leveraging the proper support channels, submitting a ticket to support, and then waiting weeks or months before getting a response back for the vulnerability, ultimately doesn't cut it. And so for kind of any folks coming from the partner channels on this call, point of sale vendors, or on the MNSP side, there has to be a call to arms here for everyone to get on the same page to make this viable in the convenience retail environment, especially in a PCI 4.0.1 authenticated vulnerability, environment with AI-driven, surfacing of vulnerabilities, right? So I think just in the interest of time, just some key takeaways before we get to, I think, one last poll. AI is accelerating how vulnerabilities are found. That time frame between attack and exploitation is measurably shrinking. Quarterly scans, like Matthew mentioned earlier, don't cut it. That's, there has to be ultimately a movement towards continuous scanning, a more frequent scanning. The PCI requirements, they're talking about managing the overall vulnerability lifecycle from assessing risk to tracking remediation of all vulnerabilities, assigning risk rankings, and ensuring that the proper compensating controls and justifications are put in place. Yes, the retail environment, especially the convenience retail environment, is very complex. It's harder to implement, but there are safe and proven ways to do this, and QSA auditors, after this first season of audits, are saying that retailers have to do this. So we have a few minutes here. Let's just get to our last poll, Nora, if you're still with us.
Why we do that, one last thing I'm going to say based on what you just talked about is, look, things are coming at us bigger, faster, stronger. It's like health. Look, you weren't as much worried about your heart when you were younger, right? You weren't worried about what you ate, how you ate, what you drank, did you drink enough water? But unfortunately, what you did at 18 and what you do at 50, they just can't be the same anymore. Things change. It's the same thing when it comes to cybersecurity. You can't sit there and say, oh, I've never been breached, i.e., I've never had a heart attack, so I don't need to worry about it. Really? So what you're going to do is wait till you have the heart attack, then worry about changing your lifestyle?
Right.
So you're going to wait to get breached before you do any of this? I don't know about you, but I don't think that's a smart business move, but what do I know?
And I think what you mentioned to us when we were chatting before this is, at the end of the day, vulnerability scanning and remediation is a very high leverage activity, because you are stopping and filling the holes that are typically earlier in the attack chain, where the hackers are looking for more scalable activities. So you get ahead of this, you remediate the vulnerabilities, you manage the ones that have a certain remediation time frame that may take a little bit longer than you want. You're doing a very high leverage activity that is getting the scalable kind of part of the attack kill chain out of the way, right?
Yep.
And then I got to say, we have a solution. We've worked very closely with the industry. We've worked very closely with auditors. We've worked very closely with the major service providers to implement a reference architecture that makes this viable. And whether you use our solution or want to learn more about that, or you're already doing your own thing, at the end of the day, for us, we care about security. We want people to be secure. We're always happy to chat. We talk to merchants all the time that are trying to implement something. They have their own tool sets, but they're still wanting to make sure that they're meeting best practices. We're here to help. Matthew, of course, always has the more stylish, cooler picture than the other presenters. Is that a go-kart?
That is a go-kart. That was in Japan.
I love it.
It was awesome.
There's my contact. There's Matthew's contact. Reach out. We're here to help. One way or the other, we got to get this done, and happy to chat about it at any point. So kind of before we close out here, we have a few minutes if there are any questions. And, let's just give it another minute here, and Nora, keep us posted if something comes in. We'll give it a minute, but while we're waiting, Matthew, I don't know if there's anything else that we missed in terms of the grand topic of vulnerability management.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the reality at the end of the day, again, bigger, faster, stronger, doing what you did before isn't going to make it okay.
Yep.
It isn't. Even though you're saying, I haven't gotten breached, well, guess what? That doesn't mean anything.
Yep.
I also haven't had a heart attack, but you know what? I'm still going to exercise, drink water, and do all the things I can to prevent it. So you can't stay stuck in the past and assume everything's going to go okay, because everyone around you is moving into the future, and what you're doing now isn't going to be good enough for what's going on later.
Right. We have a couple softball questions here coming our way. The first one is, are we screwed? So my answer to that is we are not yet. I'm not going to be categorical about it. If the Terminator day comes, you'll hear it from me first. But we can manage risk. We can make ourselves not an easy target. We can reduce any likelihood of broad and severe impact in case an intrusion does happen, and we can respond quickly. So at the end of the day, there's managing risk and managing consequences. Let's manage the risk, and that is viable. Another question that came in, what are immediate steps a retailer can take today before they implement a solution like yours? Well, why don't you get your point of sale environment up to speed? Make sure it's running the latest version it can run. If it's out of date software, it's very difficult to be managing environments and dealing with vulnerabilities if you're running, you know, a 2005 version of hardware. And believe it or not, we do see that, and that doesn't make anybody's life easier. You do ultimately have to have properly managed assets. You have to try as best as possible and aim as best as possible to be running the latest software versions. And then the other thing for this questioner here is have a managed network service provider in place. If you're a branded environment, you know, you are and using Verifone, NCR, Gilbarco, whatever, using the common POS architectures, you probably are. But if you're self-managed, you still need to make sure that you have a properly segmented network. If you have an open network, and you wouldn't believe what we find sometimes out there, it's pretty hard to secure. So there are things you can do up front. Make sure your firewall configurations are properly implemented and checked. And that, without a doubt, makes vulnerability scanning a lot more easy, scalable, efficient, and effective. So I think we're up against time. I want to thank Matthew for jumping on, and I had to kind of pull the reins because I know we could probably go for a few hours on this. So
yeah, I'm kind of passionate about this stuff.
Awesome. Take care, guys.
Thank you, everybody.